1944, the war still burns across Europe. But here, thousands of miles away from the front lines, in a quiet American prisoner of war camp, the guns have gone silent. Instead of the sound of artillery, there's the clatter of trays, the hum of conversation, and the faint aroma of roasted meat drifting through the air. The women seated at the long wooden tables are not civilians. They are German female POWs, nurses, auxiliaries, and clerks captured from the collapsing edges of the Reich. For weeks, they had braced themselves for humiliation or starvation. Instead, they are met with something they could never have imagined. A soldier opens the mess hall door, and a rush of warm air carries the scent of coffee, bread, and butter. The Americans line up the trays: mashed potatoes, beef stew, fresh fruit, and slices of pie. The German women freeze. For a moment, time stops. They glance at each other, disbelief etched on every face. They eat like this every day? One whispers under her breath, her voice trembling between shock and envy. In that instant, the war feels far away. These women, trained to see Americans as the enemy, now witness a side of their captors that defies every image they had been taught. 1944, somewhere in the American heartland. The war in Europe still raged like a storm, but inside this fenced compound, the air was still. Rows of wooden barracks stood in quiet order, surrounded by barbed wire that glinted faintly in the winter light. The sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed between the low buildings, mingling with the distant hum of trucks and the occasional bark of a guard's command. Inside one of those buildings, the camp's mess hall, the smell of food was thick and warm, carrying across the cold air like a whisper of home. Roasted meat, fresh bread, onions sizzling in butter. To the Americans working the kitchen, it was just another lunch. But for the newly arrived German female prisoners of war, it was the first real meal they had seen in months. They entered in silence, 20, maybe 30 of them, escorted by guards who spoke little but gestured politely toward the long wooden tables. Their boots clattered on the floorboards, their breath faintly visible in the chill. Their uniforms were faded grey, creased and worn, their insignia stripped away but still visible as faint outlines on the cloth. Most of them were young, in their 20s. Clerks, nurses, communication aides who had been captured during the Allies' final pushes through occupied France. Their faces carried the exhaustion of a collapsing world. They had spent days in transit, packed into military trucks, unsure where they were being taken or what awaited them. Many expected interrogation, perhaps even punishment. They had seen newsreels, propaganda, warnings that the enemy was ruthless. But as the mess hall door creaked open, what awaited them was something entirely different. A wave of warm air rolled over them, thick with the smell of roasted beef and coffee. The room glowed faintly under the yellow bulbs that hung from above. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, darkened by years of smoke and oil. The Americans behind the counter wore aprons instead of uniforms. Some smiled faintly as the women stepped inside, though none spoke beyond a few practical words. Trays on the left. Line up. At first, the German women hesitated. Their instincts told them this was a test, that perhaps this comfort was false. But hunger has a way of silencing doubt. One by one, they stepped forward. A large steel ladle dipped into a pot, and a mound of mashed potatoes was dropped onto a tray. Then came slices of beef, steaming and tender, peas, a buttered roll, even fruit, orange wedges glistening in syrup. The smells were overwhelming. One woman's eyes widened as she saw a slice of pie being set on her tray. Another bit her lip, unsure whether to take it. They had been trained to view the Americans as decadent, gluttonous, wasteful. Yet here they stood, being fed with the same care as any soldier in uniform. No one spoke for a long time as they carried their trays to the tables. The sound of metal utensils clinking against tin plates filled the air. The benches creaked as the women sat, glancing nervously toward the guards posted at the corners. The guards, however, looked disinterested. One leaned against the wall, sipping from a mug of coffee, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The first bites were cautious, almost ceremonial. A young woman with blonde hair, tucked neatly under a kerchief, lifted her fork, paused, and looked at her neighbor as if asking permission to begin. Then quietly, she tasted the mashed potatoes. Her eyes widened. The food was warm, rich, real. It wasn't the watery soup or dry bread they had grown used to. It was the kind of meal they hadn't seen since before the war. The tension in the room began to ease. Forks moved faster, spoons scraped plates. Whispers started, faint, uncertain words in German. One woman leaned forward and whispered, "They eat like this every day." Her tone was half disbelief, half envy. Another nodded slowly, her mouth still full, eyes glancing toward the American cooks moving behind the counter. Outside, snow began to fall, coating the camp in a soft white blanket. Inside, the warmth of food and light created an almost unreal calm. For the first time since their capture, the women allowed themselves to breathe. Some looked at the American flag hanging on the wall, not as an enemy symbol, but as something strangely human. Others thought of home, of their mothers and sisters who had no such meals left in bombed-out German towns. A few felt guilt, even shame, that while their countrymen starved, they as prisoners were eating better than many free citizens. A sergeant walked by, his boots heavy on the floor. He paused, looked at their trays, and gave a small nod, almost respectful, before moving on. There was no shouting, no taunting, no deliberate humiliation, only silence and the soft rhythm of normalcy, something none of them had known for years. At one table, two women sat close together. One named Lotte had been a nurse in occupied Belgium. The other, Ingrid, was a radio operator. Lotte whispered, "I thought they would treat us like animals." Ingrid smiled faintly. "Maybe we were wrong." They both laughed, and quietly, awkwardly, the sound almost alien in that grim hall. Across the room others began to talk too. Some exchanged stories, others stared at their food as if memorizing it. A few cried silently, overwhelmed not by hunger, but by the sudden realization that their captors were showing them something they had forgotten existed: decency. The meal stretched on. The Americans refilled coffee pots and passed around extra bread. One cook, an older man with grey hair, joked with a fellow soldier near the stove. When he noticed one of the German women staring curiously, he simply nodded and gestured to the coffee urn, asking if she wanted more. She hesitated, then nodded shyly. He poured without a word. There was no triumph here, no performance. Just food, shared between enemies who, for a brief moment, were no longer enemies. By the time the women finished, their trays were nearly spotless. The nervous tension had faded into something else. Quiet gratitude, perhaps even confusion. How could this be? The world outside was burning, their cities in ruins, and yet inside this camp they were being treated with dignity. One by one they carried their trays back to the counter. Some muttered "Danke" under their breath. Others couldn't speak at all. The Americans nodded, collecting trays with mechanical ease. For them it was routine. For the women it was history. A moment that would never leave them. When the guards motioned for them to line up and return to their quarters, they did so silently, but not fearfully. As they stepped out into the cold, the wind hit their faces, sharp and biting. Yet something in them had changed. The world had not suddenly become kind, but it had proven that kindness could still exist. Back inside the mess hall, a cook wiped the counter with a rag, muttering something about the next group coming in. He had no idea that for the women who just left, that meal was a revelation, a small act of humanity that shattered everything they had been taught to believe. That night, as the camp lights dimmed, Lotte lay awake in her bunk. The others were already asleep, their breaths steady in the dark. She stared at the wooden ceiling, thinking of her father back home, of the rationed bread, the hunger, the fear. She thought of the steaming potatoes, the taste of real coffee, and she whispered softly to herself, "They eat like this every day." The words echoed faintly in her mind, a mixture of wonder, disbelief, and something like hope. For a brief moment, she wasn't a prisoner. She was simply a woman who had seen that mercy could exist even in war, and in that quiet, between the hum of the guards' patrol outside and the creak of the wooden roof above, she made a silent promise to remember this day, not as humiliation, but as proof that humanity was not entirely lost. It began quietly, not with a speech or a rule, but with a routine. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner day after day. The women lined up, received their trays, sat at the same long tables, and ate under the same dim bulbs that hummed faintly overhead. What had first been a moment of disbelief soon became something steady, almost comforting. At first, they still carried themselves stiffly, like soldiers waiting for orders. But gradually, the tension in their shoulders began to ease. They spoke softly among themselves, laughed occasionally, and sometimes, almost without realizing, smiled at the Americans who served them. The guards noticed the change too. The fear that had once filled the room was dissolving into something human. The Americans never made a show of their kindness. They did not call it mercy. They did not lecture the prisoners about freedom or democracy. They simply treated them as people, fed them, spoke to them with a kind of measured respect, and kept the routine of life moving. For men who had seen too much of the war's cruelty, this was their quiet rebellion, not to hate. Each meal became a wordless dialogue. The German women, once part of a machine built on propaganda and mistrust, now sat face to face with the same people they had been taught to despise. It was an uncomfortable realization at first. How could the enemy be so ordinary, so calm? The image they had carried of the Americans, loud, arrogant, cruel, began to unravel with every cup of coffee poured and every meal served without malice. A few of the prisoners, those who spoke some English, began to exchange short greetings. "Good morning. Thank you. Coffee?" The Americans would nod, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes too tired to react at all. But even that small connection was enough to make the air feel different, lighter. Among the women was one named Margaret, who had once worked as a secretary for a German army officer. She had been raised on strict discipline and nationalist pride. Her brother had died on the Eastern Front, her father in an air raid. She had been captured near Cherbourg and had sworn to never show weakness in front of the enemy. But one morning, as she sat in the mess hall eating oatmeal with a spoon that rattled softly against the tin, she found herself watching one of the cooks, a tall young man with freckles, barely older than she was. He was laughing with another soldier, flicking water at him from a bucket. It was such an ordinary, playful gesture that it caught her off guard. For a moment she felt an ache she couldn't describe, a mix of sorrow and envy. How strange, she thought, that the men she had been told were monsters could still find laughter in a place like this. Across the room, two others, Gerda and Anna, whispered to each other over their bread. "They don't hate us," Gerda said quietly, glancing at the guards. Anna shook her head. "No, they don't even look at us like enemies." Gerda tore a piece of bread in silence. Maybe they never wanted this war either. The thought lingered like a soft wind between them. They didn't speak of it again, but it stayed, a seed planted in the stillness of captivity. Sometimes the American soldiers would share small stories, not much, just fragments. A guard might mention his farm back home, or a younger one would talk about his mother's cooking. The words were casual, spoken as if to no one in particular, but the women listened. Each detail reminded them that the men in front of them had homes, families, and dreams, just like theirs. And gradually, that realization began to change something deep inside. The war had taken everything that made people human. It had replaced empathy with obedience and fear with hatred. But here, behind barbed wire and fences, humanity crept back in through the simplest of things. A hot meal, a polite nod, the quiet clink of dishes being washed side by side. The cooks treated the food seriously. Even though the camp had its rations, they tried to make each meal count. One of them, Sergeant Wilson, a man in his 40s, took pride in making sure everyone got enough. Prisoners or not, he'd say, they're still people. Some of the younger guards rolled their eyes at his sentiment, but no one disagreed. Wilson had seen the aftermath of battles, the hunger, the eyes of men dying in the mud, and he wasn't about to let anyone starve on his watch. To the prisoners, Wilson became a quiet symbol of something larger. They didn't know his name, but they recognized his presence. He served without arrogance, without pity. And when one of the women shyly offered a whispered "Danke schön," he'd simply nod and move to the next tray. As weeks turned into months, the mess hall transformed. The first awkward silences gave way to soft murmurs of conversation. The Americans began to joke lightly among themselves even when the women were present, and the women, to their own surprise, found comfort in those sounds. The clatter of dishes, the low hum of voices, it was almost peaceful. It wasn't friendship, not yet. But it was something equally powerful: understanding. One evening during dinner, a storm rolled through the plains. The wind howled against the wooden walls, rain beating hard against the small, grimy windows. The power flickered, plunging the room into near darkness before the generator kicked in. For a brief moment all sound stopped. The guards, the cooks, the prisoners, everyone looked up, listening to the storm's fury outside. Then one of the Americans, a young private with dark hair, chuckled softly and said, "Guess even the skies had enough of this war." The comment, though simple, rippled through the room. A few soldiers laughed quietly. One of the German women smiled without realizing it. For a single heartbeat, they were no longer divided by flags or ideology, just people enduring the same storm under the same roof. Afterward, when the lights steadied, the meal continued. But something in that silence had changed them all. Later that night, in the barracks, Anna whispered to Gerda, "Do you think they pity us?" Gerda shook her head. "No, I think they just see us." The distinction mattered. Being pitied was humiliation. Being seen, that was different. It meant they were still human. Each day reinforced that truth. The Americans didn't soften the rules. The guards were firm, and the fences still stood. But within those boundaries there was dignity. The women were expected to work, to follow orders, to keep order among themselves. But when they ate, they were equals in hunger and gratitude. The food itself became a bridge between two worlds. To the Americans it was routine: stew, bread, potatoes, fruit. To the Germans it was a revelation. They began to talk about it in letters home, describing it in detail, the warmth, the abundance, the strange kindness of it all. Some letters never reached their families, but the words were written anyway. Writing became a way to preserve the memory of decency in a time when decency was rare. A few of the Americans noticed this too. One day, Sergeant Wilson was cleaning up after lunch when he found a scrap of paper left behind on a table. The handwriting was careful, neat, and unmistakably German. He couldn't read the words, but at the bottom was a small sketch: a bowl of soup, a spoon, and beside it, a small heart. He didn't tell anyone. He just folded it, slipped it into his pocket, and kept it there for the rest of the war. The kindness was never discussed aloud. No one would have called it that, but everyone felt it. The war was still raging beyond the fences, cities burning, soldiers dying. Yet within the camp a fragile peace existed. Not the kind written in treaties, but the kind that lives in small, unspoken gestures. For the German women, it was transformative. The experience forced them to confront everything they had been told. The propaganda that had filled their youth now felt hollow compared to the evidence before their eyes. The Americans were not perfect. They were stern, weary, and sometimes impatient, but they were not cruel. And that difference mattered more than anything. By spring, when the snow melted and green grass began to appear outside the camp fences, the mealtime routine had become the heartbeat of their days. The women looked forward to it, not for the food alone, but for the strange calm that came with it. It was a reminder that even inside captivity, there could be order, care, and the faint echo of normal life. Years later, Many of them would write about it in journals and memoirs. They didn't remember the exact taste of the food, but they remembered the feeling of being seen, of being treated as people, of sitting in silence across from the enemy and realizing that humanity had not vanished from the earth. Some said that meal was when the war finally ended for them. Not on the day Germany surrendered, but in that mess hall, long after the war had ended, long after the guns had fallen silent and the cities lay in ruins. The memory of that day, or rather those days, lingered in the minds of the German women who had once been prisoners of war. The formalities of liberation had come and gone, the fences dismantled, the camps closed, the soldiers returned home. Yet for many of these women, the experience of being fed with care and dignity in an American mess hall remained etched into their memory with an almost sacred clarity. It was not simply the act of receiving food that had left an impression, but the quiet humanity that accompanied it, the subtle acknowledgement of their personhood in a time when the world had tried so hard to strip them of it. For decades afterward, the women would recount that memory in letters, diaries, and private conversations. Many had kept journals during their captivity, filling the pages with mundane details of daily routines, names of fellow prisoners, and occasional sketches of the mess hall or the guards. In these writings, the meals stood out vividly, not as culinary delights, but as symbols of something larger. One woman, Anna, described how she had kept the memory of a single slice of apple pie, its warmth, sweetness, and the small smile of the cook who handed it to her, as a talisman against the darker memories of war. Another, Lotta, recalled the soft glow of the lanterns overhead and the rhythmic clatter of utensils, a sound that had become a lullaby of reassurance amid uncertainty. The act of eating together, despite the barriers of uniform and language, had revealed to them a truth that no battle could erase, even in captivity. Compassion could survive. This understanding did not come all at once. Initially, there had been disbelief, suspicion, and a lingering fear that the Americans' generosity might be a trick. But as the days passed, it became impossible to deny the consistency of their treatment. Every meal followed the same quiet routine, trays filled with warm, plentiful food, soldiers who moved with measured, careful respect, and a silence that spoke louder than words, allowing the women to reclaim a small fragment of their dignity. In those moments, the harsh realities of defeat and loss were softened by something as simple as a steaming plate of stew or a slice of bread, reminding them that even in the aftermath of violence, basic humanity could endure. The lessons carried forward from those moments were subtle but profound. For many of the women, the experience reshaped their understanding of what it meant to be human. The war had been an education in cruelty, propaganda, and survival, but the mess hall had offered a counter-narrative, one in which respect, kindness, and empathy existed even among supposed enemies. In later years, some of the former prisoners would speak about this realization to their families, recounting how the experience had changed the way they viewed not only Americans, but people in general. It was a memory that emphasized patience, recognition of others' humanity, and the small, sustaining power of decency. Some women went further, reflecting on how this simple act of nourishment contrasted with the chaos and destruction outside the camp walls. They remembered friends and family who had starved during air raids, towns reduced to rubble, and the constant threat of death that had defined their wartime lives. In that context, the provision of a proper meal, offered without malice, without pretense, without expectation, took on a significance that transcended the physical act itself. It became an emblem of resilience, a proof that even in the darkest times human beings could choose care over cruelty, dignity over degradation. The small gestures of those soldiers, who themselves were often young men enduring the war's burdens, became lasting markers of morality, compassion, and the enduring capacity for goodness. The impact of those memories was also deeply personal. For individuals like Margaret and Gerda, the experience of being seen, treated with consideration, and given sustenance, allowed them to reclaim a sense of self that had been diminished by war. They could recall not only the taste of the food, but the expressions of the soldiers, the flicker of lantern light across the mess hall, and the sound of laughter that occasionally broke the otherwise quiet atmosphere. These sensory recollections became intertwined with lessons in resilience and forgiveness, that even amidst conflict, humanity could exist, and that recognizing it in others could sustain one through the long shadow of trauma. For some, the memories were bittersweet. They would reflect on the disparity between their own treatment as prisoners and the suffering endured by civilians back home, the losses of family members, and the destruction of familiar landscapes. Yet even in these reflections, there was recognition of the profound gift they had received, a lesson in grace under conditions of extreme adversity. The generosity and dignity extended by their captors became a benchmark against which they measured humanity, influencing their actions, their expectations of others, and even the ways they would later raise their own children by the time the decades had passed. The stories of those meals had transformed into quiet legends among former POWs. They were recounted not in boastfulness, but in reverent tones, often as reminders that acts of care, no matter how small, could leave lasting impacts on those who received them. Memoirs would describe not just the taste of food, but the subtler, enduring impressions, a nod of recognition from a cook, a shared smile across the table, the reassuring routine of being served consistently and respectfully. These moments lingered as touchstones of hope and proof that decency was possible, even in a world that had often seemed devoid of it. Some women carried these memories into post-war life, using them to shape their relationships, their communities, and their own moral frameworks. The awareness that care and empathy could persist despite division and enmity influenced their work, their social interactions, and their approach to conflict. The lessons of the mess hall, that kindness could exist even in the midst of captivity, were powerful, enduring, and quietly revolutionary in their implications. Even photographs taken decades later sometimes reflected this lingering memory. Images of the former prisoners in reunions, smiling and exchanging stories, often evoked the same emotions as those first shared meals. The faint warmth of human connection, so vividly experienced in a dimly lit mess hall long ago, had endured over time. In some cases, the women themselves annotated old photographs with the names of the soldiers who had served them, or the sketches of the mess hall where they had learned a profound lesson in humanity. Ultimately, that meal, repeated day after day, simple and unremarkable on the surface, became something far greater than nourishment. It was a testament to the quiet, transformative power of empathy, of seeing others as human beings worthy of care, respect, and dignity. It was a memory that endured not only because of what was eaten, but because of what was given: acknowledgement, recognition, and the extraordinary revelation that even in the harshest conditions, compassion could survive. Those who survived carried the lesson with them, sharing it quietly with family, friends, and subsequent generations. They understood that the world could be cruel, but that moments of grace were never lost to history if they were remembered. And in remembering, they preserved not only their own humanity, but a universal truth, that kindness has the power to outlast violence, fear, and hatred, leaving a legacy far richer than any victory or defeat in war. For the women who had once sat across those wooden tables, staring at steaming trays and hesitant soldiers, the meals were never just meals. They were proof that the simplest acts, a plate of food, a respectful glance, a shared routine, could ripple through time, shaping lives, changing perceptions, and quietly affirming that even in the aftermath of destruction, hope and decency